My name's Bill Wise. I've been a forester for 55 years, or married 55 years, the same thing goes together. I had a little farm over the road when I got married, and then my wife and I gave up the lease on that and moved over to this place here. The original farm was 370 acres. We're 20k from Balclutha and 100k from Port Chalmers. So if you're producing logs here, it pays to produce quality. Some of the logs we produced here have had 3 metres in the butt log of cube clear wood. So they're pretty profitable. We tend to run to 30 years plus with our trees. There's no need to cut them down at 25. We were going to, but we managed to work it out with the family, and the kids bought into the trees, so that enabled us to get another 5 years on the growth, which has really been profitable. This place was the back of another homestead. There were 3 ridges. We're standing on what was the rough. Behind me is a place called Flaxie. You can hardly see it for the trees, and the place gully across there, the ridge over there, is known as the back of the rough, so God knows what that makes it. However, it was very poor. It was divided into 2 paddocks, nothing else. A lot of scrub, very low soil fertility. We started off with 500 ewes, lost 100 of them the first year and marked 350 lambs. So it gives you some idea how bleak and poor it was. Now 1,400 ewes, 400 hoggets, and we're increasing trees at the same time. So the original farm now has got over 50% of it's in trees without affecting the stocking rate in any way. When we started, we had a few trees up at the house, which is up the, you can see the leftovers there. We planted steadily. I used to buy second-hand netting and posts and whatnot at clearing sales, and I would try to get 2 to 3 acres a year in planting. We started over on the west side, that was where the weather came from, went right down the gully and back up this ridge, and then the last few years we've done all the big central gullies. The land ranges from class 5 to class 8. 8 you can't stand on, put it that way. They're extremely steep, very shallow soils on the faces, a lot of gorse. The original boundary fence went along the skyline there between the stations, and there was a sod wall. There's still remnants of it there, and that's where the gorse came from, regrettably. People who were kind to us were the marginal lands who had a great belief in what we were doing, and the stock firm who sort of drew in their breath sharply every time I mentioned planting more trees, but tolerated it. And with great pleasure I took the first cheque from the trees in and said, "Here, help yourself." The big benefit on this country was the rural water scheme came through. That was a tremendous advantage. It meant you weren't relying on a few dams that died up in the gully in the winter. In the summer. There were very few springs. That yet smaller block there has been logged once. That block at the top end by those blue gums has been logged. This here was logged last year, where the bare ground is, and the yield on that was average was $65 a tonne. So it was that was after costs. So we're fairly expensive hauling and carting and whatnot. Right, now the initial scheme was that we were going to harvest at 25 years old, and that would give us enough to retire off the farm. Well, that was a bit of a joke because prices crashed and everything fell to bits. So I said to the children who were grown up at this stage, if you like to buy into the trees on a basis, say over 10 years, we will sell you 20% of the trees, because 3 children and my wife, who gets her share naturally. So that worked out very well, which meant we could defer cutting the trees down for 10 years. Now the children have had a 300% return on their money so far, so they're doing very well. It comes up, the average return, I've figured it, even adjusted for inflation and all the rest, still works out $1,000 a hectare net per annum, which isn't too bad. what I would advise people to do is look at your farm, see what are the good faces, the good grazing faces and whatnot you can do without. Go to your poor faces and start on them first. Don't go and plant good ground in trees because you'll be disappointed, A, with the grass that grows underneath them. But you've got to harden your heart a bit because anything will grow a bit of grass when it's shut up because of leached fertility from the top of the hill or anything like that. But you will find after about 3 years you can put stock back into it. And that grass will disappear very, very quickly. Just don't flog the trees, damage the trees by overgrazing, leave them to it. The other thing I would emphasise is that fertility is going to move off the tops of the hills into the gully. And you're going to think, oh crumbs, I shouldn't have planted that in trees. But then the trees will come up through it and you'll find, oh wow, that's pretty good. And then one day someone will come down the road and offer you some money for the trees. I would advise, look after your trees. There's lots of arguments going on, prune, not prune, blah, 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 do this. We've always pruned and always thinned. Don't thin too much, 400 a hectare. Don't be a purist or anything and come down to 100. It's the volume we're after, and the minimum log size is what they will pay you for. So make sure your trees come above the minimum. If you've got plenty in and you're doing quite well, leave them there. They're much better money than in the bank. I mean, the prices will fluctuate and whatnot. You don't like the price, leave them there till the price comes up again. I began planting on my own. There was no sort of assistance or anything, bar the Forest Service, who were very good. But then we were approached by a bloke from the North Island, Neil Barr and others, and we founded a Farm Forestry Association down here. I became secretary and did all sorts of things. We got into tree sales. The Forest Service made trees available for us, which we sold to members. And that enabled us to accrue quite a lot of funds, which we could do things with. We provided a scholarship for people, but everyone's encouraged. The thing is, when you start planting trees, your neighbour will look over the fence and say, oh, gosh, they don't look bad, do they? And the neighbour will come down and there's a funny story about a bloke talking to another neighbour, and he said, what do you want to plant trees for? And, oh, it's dreadful, isn't it, all the rest, all this good ground going into trees. Hang on a minute, here's a shower coming through, we'll go and stand behind this tree. But that was the story, but it makes the whole property easy to run. The only difficulty is, as you can see from here, you can't see an entire paddock from the opposite ridge. These flats here were very, very wet. They'd never been ploughed, as you can see. I ploughed them once and put Swedes in them. It wasn't a bad crop, but continued very wet and get stuck. Unfortunately, a neighbour down the bottom had a dam, and instead of building a decent overflow, he put the overflow through a bit of clay in the paddock. And decent flood. This creek can run bankers, believe it or not. It's a small catchment. It continued to wash out. By that stage, fortunately, we had the poplars in. So they were sort of filling up and holding nicely. But as you can see, an enormous amount of damage. It made the flat almost unusable, except for grazing animals. As you can see, we tended to go up high when we were pruning for fodder. We've done these trees 4 times in drought, and they've been excellent for stock food. In fact, you've got to put the stock out while you cut the trees, or you're going to kill a couple. They push each other under the branches, you go first sort of thing. We've used poplars quite extensively in little slips up the main gully, around here, and then along up the flat there. So they're a very attractive colour, but as you can see, they get the bug in the autumn. That knocks them a bit, but they're still very, very nice for 6 months a year, so we can't object to that too much. Start with small areas. Try to get a length of block of trees because it's going to give you shelter, even if it's a long thin block. When you get those in, start to look elsewhere. You've got some shelter, that's fine. You're looking at, I used to go to clearing sales, 3-inch posts, I got them for 75 cents each. Old netting for $10 a roll, and had patched it up a bit. But some of those fences have lasted 30 years simply because there's not the same pressure on it. And of course with the hot wire coming in, you can protect a fence like nobody's business. As far as income goes, if you look at perhaps 5 hectares, 10 hectares a year, which the property will stand because there's 100 hectares in it, gross or net income of around about 150,000, 100 to 150,000 a year, which is not too hard to sort of spread around and enjoy. And the replanting is the son's problem. He does that and carries on with that because they're all into his name. But as I say, we had my trees initially, then we had our trees initially. Now we've got the children's trees, the 3 children, and we've got my son's trees, again a separate block.